Well, great to be here, everybody. Thank you so much. And I'm relying on you to try and stay awake through till 1 o'clock. I was a little worried when I heard Andrew kicking off this morning that what we were saying was going to be somewhat repetitive, but I'm thrilled to say that masterly presentation of Andrew's really laid the foundations at a philosophical level for what I'm going to be dealing with at a more practical level today. And I hope you'll see a quite wonderful complementarity between those two presentations. So let me begin by telling you about a conversation I had at my front door 3 or 4 years ago. It was the local elections, and I opened my door to a canvasser from a party that I can say I very much do not support. And our differences emerged pretty quickly, and the tone and tenor of the conversation changed pretty quickly as well. It would never have come to blows, I don't think, but there was a palpable hostility both in the tone and the body language as we began to square up to one another. And had that conversation continued along the expected lines, we'd soon be trading the ad hominem insults which litter our social media. Bigot, Marxist crybaby, capitalist, snowflake, corporate shill, so on and so forth. It didn't come to that because, on impulse, I said something like, look, actually that's what politicians always do, have you noticed? Look, it's a very good bridging statement, actually, look, you know. But I said, look, I've just realized we both want so many of the same things. We both want the powerful, the exploiter, the bully taken down, and we both want to see the little guy at the end of the queue lifted up. And I can tell you that's at the very core of my own faith as a Christian. If it doesn't sound too patronizing, I really sense that's what's driving your heart too, and it's getting you out going door to door on a Saturday morning while I'm at home, so I really respect that. But look, maybe we differ not so much in what we both want, but in how to get there. So why don't we have a conversation kind of about that? And there was a remarkable shift in the dynamics of the conversation. We even had a little hug at the end before he went. And we didn't persuade each other one bit. But reframing the dynamics of the conversation in terms of our shared common ground at least allowed a more rational conversation then to take place. You see, we like to think that conversations go like this. It's what we like to think. Two people talking to one another. The people is the little man on the elephant. And he's talking to the other little man on the elephant. And the little man on the right elephant says, 3 reasons you're wrong. And ideally, the little man on the left elephant says, I take your point. Good work. Let me think about the other 2. You know, I take your point about the first point. Let me think about the other 2. That's how we'd like. But sadly, they don't go like this because people are not the little man on the top. What I'm doing is drawing on Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, public intellectual in the States, his work, which characterizes the totality of the person as the little man, which is our rational, logical, analytic selves, who sits on the elephant, who is everything else about us. And we like to think that our apologetic conversations go like that the little man on one elephant speaks to the other and we have a logical exchange. But as I found, they don't. And the domain of the elephant, the everything else about us, is fast, knee-jerk, emotional, broad brush, and powerful. And so your conversation actually goes more like this, okay? 3 reasons you're wrong. You annoy me. He thinks he's speaking to the other man on the top, but actually he's speaking to the entire person. He's speaking to the elephant as well. And the elephant, as I say, is the domain of the emotional reaction, the emotional appraisal, the readiness to discern the motivations behind the points that my conversation partner is making. The elephant is really listening to his tone of voice and his patronizing little thing of the hand there. That's the world of the elephant. And if he doesn't like them, he says, I don't like you. And so the man on top, now sensing the reaction of the elephant, says, rather than, yes, good point, 3 reasons, ambitious. Let me know when you get one that's vaguely relevant. And we're off, you see. And our elephants are engaged. So you can marshal the best arguments to captivate the rider, but to be persuasive, you have to win the elephant as well. So, okay, here's how we're going to spend the rest of our time this morning. First part, we're going to look closer at the elephant and rider model. Then, building on what we've seen, I'm going to offer 5 key principles for more effective apologetic conversations. After that, we'll open the floor for discussion, and then with any luck, we'll be ready for lunch. Okay, so the rider and the elephant model, first used, as I say, by the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. It broadly maps onto a dual process theory of how the brain operates. What the great Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman called System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 thinking is the elephant, fast, automatic, effortless. It operates subconsciously, driven by intuition, ingrained habits. We're talking about gut instincts, snap moral judgments. You disgust me. What you're saying disgusts me, you see. Emotions that draw us toward a person, hope, joy, or away from them, disgust, anger. We're talking about subconsciously generated discomforts in the world of the elephant. You know, Glynn Harrison's talks, you know, ask me about it, I can't stand. The way, you know, what he says seems okay, but the way he does that with his fingers like that, and that little tone of voice, you know, it just triggers something in me, and I don't know what it is, but I just want to get out. And, oh, wait a minute, yeah, he reminds me of my dad. That's it, that little patronizing, you know. And this is the sphere of the elephant, and the elephant is operating all the time, pre-consciously, subconsciously, and influencing the thinking, the rational responses of the rider. So these subconsciously generated sensibilities are fast and automatic. In contrast, there's System 2 thinking, which is slower, deliberative. The System 2 thinker, the rider, aligned with many of the values of the left brain, notably language, logic, and linearity, works much more slowly and analytically. And as a result, because the elephant is fast, the rider is often left somewhat like a US-style presidential press secretary. And the elephant in the next room has just blurted something out, and you have to go and stand and justify what they have said. And that's the role that the rider finds themselves in very often. So if they don't like you, they are searching for reasons to justify that first response. So all of this has a lot of implications for the way we present our arguments. Well, you might say, nice model, but does the science stack up? Well, with the usual caveat that things are always more complex than they seem, and we said before that Ian McGilchrist, where it's contested. Of course it's contested. Everything is contested in the sphere of neuroscience, psychology, and the social sciences. Indeed, in science more general. So I don't have time to go into much of the scientific evidence that lies behind this, but my own judgment of the evidence is in the round. This is a broadly valid model. What we mustn't do is align system 1, the elephant with the right brain, although it shares many of the values of the right brain in McGilchrist's model, with the left. Kahneman never argued that his systems 1 and 2 were structurally represented in the brain. And what we've discovered since then is, in fact, system 1 and 2 networks are distributed between the right and left lobe. So it's not as simple as that. But nevertheless, as modes of thinking, Daneman's conceptual model of system 1 and system 2 is really helpful and, I believe, valid. One example is David Navan's influential 1977 paper in the field of cognitive psychology. It's called Forest Before Trees. Forest Before Trees. Using simple visual stimuli, large letters made up of smaller, different letters like this, Navan showed that on balance, people typically see the overall shape first, the forest, before noticing the smaller components, the trees. And our brains seem generally wired, although I don't like that term, to grasp wholes before analysing parts. And in fairness to McGilchrist's model, which I think is also has some wonderfully valid and important points to make, McGilchrist would say, reflecting on this, the right brain orientates to the whole, passes the information that it's perceived to the left brain, which then hones down on the detail, and then passes that information back to the right brain to be integrated together. So you see, we say, HHSS. Hang on a minute. The H is composed of little h's and the S of little s's. You see, and that, in general, is how we as human beings perceive. But you notice I keep saying in general because everything is on a spectrum. And I was chatting to somebody just last week in a coffee bar, and I showed him this. We were talking about this, I showed it on my phone. He said, well, no, all I can see is the little H and little S's. He went zoom straight in, which is just a little reminder. We all bring our personality type to this. And he would be someone who, in McGilchrist's model, would tend to be more left brain than right. And there's that distribution here today. But in general, the population, we see the forest, and then we see the trees. And that's how it goes. So the bottom line of all this is that in today's angry and polarized world especially, unless you can talk to the elephant, you're not having a conversation, you're staging a duel, right? And that's the bottom line of what I'm trying to say. Okay, so now the second part. Heeding what we've just heard, what are the principles that should guide our conversations? What passes between the elephant and the rider and the elephant and the rider? But listen up, everybody, because I think this is important. It's not about mastering the dark arts of psychological deception that I want to speak. You know, moving the elephant from point A to B and the rider hardly notices. No, that is not what we're into. The point of the winning the elephant isn't so that we can bypass the rider. On the contrary, it is the opposite to that. As I think Andrew again said so elegantly, the Christian faith insists that we deal with reality, with the truth of things. Reason has always been integral to how we understand our encounter with the living God and the reality he has made. Truth matters. Reason is integral. But if we want to gain a hearing for the truth, We need to be mindful of the pre-rational forces that cloud people's perceptions of it, and do what we can to mitigate those pre-rational forces. So my point is not to dispense with the rider at all, but rather to emphasize that the path to persuading him or her runs through the elephant. Okay? So, building on these insights, what are the principles that might guide some of the conversations we're having out there? Well, there's 5 of them. I must have. Where's my principles gone? There they are. Resonate, respond, refute, reframe, recognize. Don't you love the alliteration? Eh? It took me hours and hours and hours. Resonate. Lead with curiosity. Listen deeply. Look for common ground. This is about our psychological posture during the conversation. Curiosity, you see, disarms. Most people expect us to proselytize. Few are prepared for genuine interest. So start with questions, not as a tactic, but a mindset. What brings you to that view? What's the concern underneath that? Has something in your experience shaped that perspective? Just help me understand a little more where you're coming from with that. Now, that kind of curiosity, you see, wins trust. And trust requires deep listening as well. Too often we're busy, and you can see it in your conversation partner, they're preparing their rebuttal while you're presenting yours. But listening means letting their words sink in. And for that, you need time. And I have to say, when I was running over this morning, I had a conversation with Philip there yesterday lunchtime, which broke every rule I'm just about talking about. And the reason we found ourselves slipping into, at times, a conversation which was a little more, what's the word, Philip? Anyway, a little more frisky, let's say, was because we didn't allow the time. And if you anticipate that this is going to be a meaningful, you must make the time. So, hey, look, let's leave this just now. We're both getting a bit heated. How about coffee tomorrow? And we'll do this properly. That allows for a proper resonance with one's conversation partner. Try this in your next conversation. Restate your partner's point. Try and summarize what they're saying back to them. And maybe they'll say, yes, that's exactly what I mean. You're winning their trust. Or they may say, I'm not sure you've quite got that right. Listen. But either way, you see, in that moment, the elephant feels heard, calms down, is willing to revisit some of those broad brushstroke perceptions that were formed of you. And then as you listen to their answers, look for common ground. My canvasser friend, we both genuinely wanted to see people do well. In our conversations about the sexual revolution, that we both share values of freedom. And so we can begin by saying, I think we both want people to be free. It's just that I think we've got kind of different ideas of how that works. Should we talk about that? Because I really I understand why you want people to be free. So, moving a little further into these hot button issues, try to resonate with your conversation partner about the harms same-sex attracted people have experienced in the past at our hands, in churches. Look, you say, I get why Christian views seem weird and even oppressive. Churches are far from perfect, and some, to my shame, still shame their own people over their God-given sexuality. So look, I think I really get where you're coming from, perhaps more than you'd realize, but I have another way of thinking about this, you see, that comes from what the Christian faith actually is, and not some of the people who've mishandled it. And I'd love to have a chat about that, because that's what drives me here. Okay, so resonate. Really important. Secondly, respond to moral foundations, not moral outrage. Now, what do I mean? Difficult conversations often surface profound differences in the way you are forming moral judgments. Back to Jonathan Haidt. Who's read his Righteous Mind? It's a great book. Must read it. Very good. In The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt, whose main work has been in moral psychology, the psychology of moral thinking, he says that we tend to see things as being right or wrong, operating from different moral foundations. So I may say something is wrong because it's unfair or it's harmful. You may say something is wrong because it violates sacred values of human life for you. That's where you're coming from, sacredness of life. They're coming from, but it's so unfair. And you're having a conversation, but you're not having a conversation because you haven't realized the different moral foundations you aspire. We've seen this recently in parliamentary debates about assisted suicide, haven't we? Most of the arguments for assisted suicide have majored on the foundations of harm and fairness. People are harmed when we allow them to suffer. It's unfair to deny somebody the freedom to choose for themselves. So wise opponents of the bill, such as MP Danny Kruger, worked hard to make their case against assisted suicide by leading with the same foundations. So he'd say, what about, I get, harm, but what about the risk of coercion of the vulnerable and the harms that'll bring? I get fairness, but is it fair to impose on vulnerable people not just the burden of their own illness, but the burden of thinking that they're a burden to other people as well? Is that fair? In what way is it fair to, when our end-of-life care is so abysmal, to be giving people the opportunity of a fast track out of this life when we can't put the resources into ending their lives peacefully and with dignity? So those were the values he perceived were in play in the public square, and so he made his arguments around them. And it was only after the disappointing debate last week that he did a very interesting long Twitter thread, but saying, this is where I'm coming from. It was almost as if he's now coming clean. He's driven by sacred values, deep convictions about the sacredness of human life as God has given it. And he puts that very clearly. Okay, so think about what moral reasoning is in play here and move into the same territory in order to build a bridge in that conversation. Third, refute. Ask hard questions. We need to ask hard questions. Somebody who's preoccupied with fairness, you say, in the sphere of the sexual revolution, you say, just help me understand, in what way is it fair that 50% of kids in this country reach the age of 16 with only one biological parent in the home? How is that fair? Kids love stability. They love to come home. And there's no finer grounding for psychological development of a child than a mother and father bound together in a covenant that will say, we're here for you for life. We'll always be here. We won't get on at times. There'll be ups and downs. But this is the foundation of your life. Kids love that. And is it fair to be eroding the foundations of that so readily, forgetting about that other half? I don't think it's fair. Now, ask hard questions. There's a lot of data that allows one to push back against the sexual revolution. Indeed, to begin to ask, has it had its day as people are looking at the fallout of this in terms of the social implications? But ask it gently. Ask it softly. But look, is it, I'm not sure. Do you think there are ways of doing this? And when we do that, we invite the other person to think with us, not just react to us. And then reframe. reframe. Having refuted aspects of your partner's ideology, it's often possible to reframe the desire that underlies that ideology in terms of one's own convictions. If freedom is being viewed as the highest good, then show how discovering one God's given purpose and then living a disciplined life that draws the soul into harmony with that design is our highest freedom in our economy, in our worldview. If someone is preoccupied with who they are, show how the blessing of God framing, of receiving from God a framing of who we are in terms of our created being and the purpose built into our very human nature, the design of it. Show someone the blessing of that and how living in harmony with our design can be our highest freedom. So I was saying yesterday, like a golfer or a violinist, they don't pick up a violin and just play it in any old way, being themselves. They have to learn the rules. They have to live in harmony with how to play a violin and learn those rules and the boundaries of that. And then once they've acquired those skills, they're free to improvise, to harmonize, to bless the world with their own created genius. That's the Christian vision. So we resonate with the freedom, but then reframe what our conversation partner desires in terms of the Christian vision. Remember too that the elephant is sensitive to stories, very sensitive to stories, especially stories that connect with the emotional dynamics in play and one's own personal story, I think, more than anything. I get where you're coming from on this. My dad was a refugee. I owe everything to this country. It gave my father the leg up. We hear politicians saying this because they're intuiting that the elephant does respond to those kind of stories. The elephant is also super sensitive to images. We were wondering what the imagination is earlier. Image is part of the clue to how we understand it. It's the ability to cast images in the mind, concepts, ideas, regions that aren't immediately present to the senses. We don't sense these things, but we build images and concepts of them, just as you are of what I'm saying just now. And stories tap into the imagination in a powerful way. And particularly, images tap into the world of the elephant as well. Back in 2015, a picture was widely distributed on the front pages of media around the world, 2015. It became known as the picture that changed the world. The time of the Syrian refugee crisis, when huge numbers were seeking to come into Europe, sparking a contentious public debate, a single picture suddenly shifted the tone and the attitudes. And indeed, there followed shortly afterward Angela Merkel's opening of the doors in many ways. Now, I'm not getting into a debate for better, for worse of that. My point is the power of images to shift, to move the elephant and to change attitudes and to hook fundamental human values of compassion, concern for the little person. And it was a picture of a little 3-year-old boy, Alan Curtis, washed up on a beach. And as the camera, its most effective, panned back, all alone, desolate, friendless, dead. Powerful image that told its own story, changed the world. Power of the elephant. The problem is, It didn't change the world for very long because attitudes very quickly then shifted back and the debate became more complex and deepened. And why is that? Because the elephant moves on very quickly. The elephant says, oh, this is terrible. And, oh, what's this over here? So that's the world of the elephant, which is why the integration of reason is so important to understand our God-given wholeness as human beings. But the pictures that were subsequently of Alan Curtis put into public artworks, it was the front page of The Guardian, The Independent, the actual picture itself, put into public art worlds in different countries. And here's one, and you see him? And it's the red and the blue motif of his pants and his shirt that's copied over and over and becomes symbolic. And at times people go down to the beach and they put on a red top and some blue trousers and they just lie as the sea washes against them. And that image shown in shoes, you see, and boots and discarded bits and pieces, was an attempt to keep his memory alive. The problem is, the elephant's moved on and these works have much, much less public impact now. Very little public impact. And that's the point. The elephant's important. We have to take him into account. But reason is required to integrate with the elephant to form a more complete picture of the world. And finally, I just want to say one last thing about the elephant as we think about reframing, getting to the elephant, and then reframing his concerns in view of the Christian vision. And that's that the elephant is also sensitive to ethos, to how you're coming over and whether your life seems to line up with what you say. And he intuits this very quickly. So it's so important that we besides talking the talk, we walk the walk and live in communities which put on display the values of which we speak. And I think Paul brings this together beautifully as we're coming into our landing zone. He says this, because our gospel came to you, not simply with words, yes, with words, because that is the proclamation of the gospel, the words of the gospel, the truth of the gospel, but not simply with words. And Andrew, mentioned earlier, a hobby horse of mine, that our preaching, our proclamation cannot be reduced to explanation, clarification, making things clearer. All we're doing then is we think that if we explain things more clearly to the rider, he'll get it. But the elephant's there saying, what about me? I don't like you. And so what we need to do is to listen to Paul, our message, our gospel, not with words, yes, but not simply with words, but also with power, with the Holy Spirit, and deep conviction. Those of you that know your Aristotle, ethos, pathos, logos, pathos, and the last one, you know how we lived among you for your sake, ethos. It's all there, the great foundations of rhetoric at the time. And so you see, the Thessalonian elephant saw how those words that were so important to Paul had shaped his convictions and satisfied his deepest longings. Even before they heard the words themselves, they saw it in him. They saw how it had formed and reshaped him at his deepest level. And they witnessed their impact in the changed lives that were being lived out before them. It's a wonderful, I think, capturing of the key elements. So, lastly, recognize the season you live in. Okay, so everything we've said so far assumes that we're operating in what you might call normal conversational space. Who am I going to talk about? You've got that smile as if I know what's coming next. I thought you were going to say Aaron Wren, because that's where we are going. But the point is that there's been some thinking within evangelical circles that we are not in normal conversational space in much of today's culture. And Aaron Wren's view is that over the past few centuries, Western culture's views of Christianity moved through 3 stages. Positive world, in which Christianity is seen generally as a social good. Yeah, 1 or 2 odd bits, but generally it's a positive thing in our society. Into neutral world, tolerated, quirky, a bit irrelevant. But this would be a world, I think Wren would say, in which, say, Tim Keller's way of intuiting how to relate is particularly effective. But now we're in a negative world. And here Christianity isn't just quirky, it is harmful, it is destructive, it is oppressive. And so you see all that stuff that I've been talking about in this analysis, the whole of the last 35, 40 minutes, been wasting our time because we're not in that conversational space. So it's no use winning the elephant. Those rules no longer apply. And why? Why wouldn't they? Because I think Wren would argue, this negative world is marked by what I'm going to call identity-based discourse. Okay? Identity-based discourse operates on a fundamentally different psychological and social level than issue-based or interest-based discourse. So when our thinking is rooted and grows out of our identity, particularly expressed in terms of race, gender, sexuality, disagreement can be perceived not just as a difference of opinion, because my views are rooted in who I am. It's not just what I think, it's who I am. So your alternative views are not another way of looking at what I think, they're an attack on who I am. And that's the problem. So disagreement isn't perceived just as a difference of opinion, it's an attack on the self, and your best efforts, attempts to resonate, to find, common ground, they're just seen as a power move on your part. Just another attempt, very subtle, these Christians, watch them, but just another attempt to turn the screws of oppression and for you to regain your cultural power that you so hate having lost. So, what do we do in this negative world? Forget the elephant, we batten down the hatches. We withdraw into close-knit communities where at least we sustain our own ideas amongst our own people with our own plausibility structures tightly in place. The Benedict option. And when we do venture out, we stand ready for confrontation. We practice rebuttal and we stand our ground. That's how you survive in this culture. And then in situations where our message will not be heard at all, we shake the dust off our feet, as Jesus suggests, and we move on. Or we fight hard power, because that's what it is, with hard power. Instruct the lawyers, fight them in the courts and on the streets and on the beaches, deploying every technical legal device we can lay our hands on. But we will defend our rights. And we won't be wasting time trying to defend the elephant or win the elephant. Now look, folks, negative world is a reality. I've been on the end of it. It's ruthless, it's dangerous, it's deeply harmful once you're in that place. And there are some important rules for surviving in a negative world that I'm not going to touch on now, but it would make a great question if anyone felt they wanted to ask that. Because all this raises a big question as we draw to a close. Is all that material about winning the elephant really redundant then, after all? If this is right, we're in a negative world, forget it, Soft power has had its day, back to hard power. Well, I submit, on the contrary, the political theorist Joseph Nye famously presented us with that binary, didn't he? There's hard power, the ability to get what you want using coercion. And then he said there's soft power, the ability to be persuasive, to exercise influence by attraction. And we thought it was that binary, but later he added a third kind of persuasive power. Smart power. Smart power. This is playing tricks on me. Anyway, smart power. Smart power is about using the right tool for the right situation. That's what he said. The ability to combine both hard and soft power resources into an effective strategy, a strategy which reads the context in which it operates and responds accordingly. And sure, there are occasions when we shake the dust off our feet and we batten down the hatches. And one of the things we've neglected to do in our own communities is to sustain our own plausibility structures. So while out there they've been talking about the sexual revolution, we've been in our pietism talking about what verse 23 says about the impassibility of God and so on. And that's fine, but, I don't want to ridicule that at all, don't get me wrong, but then we send our young people out unequipped. And they know what that crusty old guy who stands up on a Sunday in church thinks, but then they see Taylor Swift and they see all the other icons of our current culture that are so attractive to them. And it was the great sociologist Peter Berger who said that a cognitive minority, and I have a whole little chapter on this in my book, A Better Story, a cognitive minority, he says, that sits in dissonance with the wider culture must sustain its own plausibility structures. It mustn't simply explain its truth to its own people. It must show the truth, make it plausible in their eyes. So important. And we took our eye off the ball and we let our young people go out, and then we wonder why they come back and say, Dad, why are we so mean to gay people? And so there is an important case for, in our communities, nurturing our plausibility structures. And there are occasions when we shake the dust off our feet and we walk away because this isn't a productive conversation. It's going nowhere. This person just wants to hurt me. And we say no to being hurt. But friends, even in the negative word, there are people there. There are hearts still restless for meaning, for purpose, for transcendence. And at this time of all times, as we see the potentially the green shoots of a slow revival of interest in faith amongst young people, now is not the time to be battening down the hatches out of fear. So yes, wise as serpents, if we're in a hard power situation, if we're being battered and bruised and no one's listening, there are times to walk away. But there are many, many, many other times where a space opens up in which we share the gospel of Christ. So I'd add a fourth category to Ren's three categories. It's negative/curious world. Negative/curious world. A world that calls for smart power, as Andrew argued at the beginning of this morning's conference, integrating reason and imagination, but expressed in smart apologetics. Thanks very much.